I am General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, and I welcome you here to the Gentleman's Parlor in my home, where today I should like to reflect with you about Appomattox, the day of the surrender, and meeting with General Lee and the surrender itself. This is April 9th, the anniversary of that somber and yet great day, and it's Palm Sunday, 1865, April 9th. I had been on the move with the Army since April the 2nd, and we've been out going into our 7th day. I've been corresponding with General Lee for the last some 48 hours, from 5 o'clock on the 7th until late last night on the 8th. General Lee had wanted me to talk with him about terms of surrender. I've made it clear all I can do is a military surrender. Lay down your arms. I don't have the authority to treat for peace. He had indeed reached out to me about the 1st of March of this year, wanting to meet one-on-one to work out difficulties, and I sent that to President Lincoln. He very sternly told me, do not meet with General Lee for any other purpose than a military surrender. You get him to stop fighting and then step back. I will step in and handle it from there with the political side of the matter. And so I told General Lee I couldn't do that. But now, the night of April the 8th, I had a migraine headache. We had moved from Farmville to Curdsville, Virginia, and I was staying in the 2-story farmhouse of a farmer who was apparently fairly well-to-do, because he had a 2-story home, and he had a piano downstairs. And I say piano instead of piano because one or two of my staff members could play, and they were wailing that piano. They were lustily beating the piano and singing. I had a severe, one of the worst I'd ever had, migraines. And I was walking about with my head on pressing my pillow, saying, I can't stand the pain, yelling with the pain, and soaking my wrists in mustard plaster, my feet in a tub of hot water with mustard plasters, and nothing would stop the pain. My physician wanted me to return to Washington City for treatment. I told him that simply could not occur. Rollins and I were having a very spirited discussion over the music and singing from downstairs. He wanted to go stop it, and I said, no, let them have their fun. Stopping the playing and singing is not going to stop my headache. And I was saying I really ought to go talk to Lee in frustration. I ought to talk to Lee, and Rollins was saying, no, you can't do that. The president has forbade you to do that. And I said, but we could work it out in an hour. And Rollins said, you can't do that. And he was yelling. In fact, officers downstairs said they could hear him, us yelling at each other. And he said, that will not do. And I relinquished and admitted he was right. I tried to get rest and I could not. About 4 o'clock in the morning, I got up to go outside. It was cold. It had been raining. It was very foggy. Had been raining off and on for days. And I called for Cincinnati. I wanted to ride him about a bit, thinking the cold, cool air would clear my head. It didn't. I went back inside the house, got some coffee, replied to Lee. He wanted to meet me that day between the lines at 10 o'clock to talk. I said, that will do no good. I can't treat for peace. I don't have the authority. It will do no good. You know full well what's required. Lay down your arms, and that will stop the fighting. I sent that back to him, got on Cincinnati, and we proceeded. Now we're heading to the northwest. By this time, Lee has been at Appomattox Court House for a day or so. All the armies have pretty much ground to a halt. We're still closing in on Lee. Meade was to his east. Sheridan had gone south and north around him and was to his west. He had Longstreet north of him, or to his east rather, at the High Bridge as his rear guard. He still wants to try to break out that morning, the 9th, at earliest daybreak, I think. He sent General John Gordon to assault the cavalry in front of him. Gordon brushed them aside, but then he ran into General Gibbon and General Ord's 30,000 men. I think the 5th Corps or 6th Corps and the Army of the James. And Gordon pulled back. He sent a message to Lee and said, "My men are fought to a frazzle. Unless General Longstreet can come to my assistance, I can do no more." Lee at that time decided it's over. He put on his finest uniform, a uniform I understand he'd never worn, and a brilliant white shirt, clean white shirt, a presentation sword that I understand was given him, a jeweled presentation sword, given him by the people of Virginia. And he put on that uniform and said, even though I'd rather die 1,000 deaths, I've got to go see General Grant. And he rode out to that place he had designated to meet me. He met instead my reply. By this time, though, he knows Gordon can't break out. He's done. And he had his assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, write out a note and send it to me that said, "I want to meet with you to surrender." Well, I sent him this note that reached me at 11:50 a.m. regarding the surrender. First of all, Major Charles Pease, I believe from New York, came thundering up in the mud and the rain, yelling and huzzahing, and stopped us. He gave me the message. I read it, gave it to Rawlins. He read it, and I said, "Will that do, Rawlins?" And Rawlins said yes. And the message that I sent back to General Lee was this: "Your note of this date is but of this moment, 11:50 a.m., received. In consequence of my having passed from the Richmond and Lynchburg road to the Farmville and Lynchburg road, and I am at this writing about 4 miles west of Walker's Church, and will push forward to the front for the purpose of meeting you. Notice sent on this road where you wish the interview to take place will meet me. Very respectfully, etc., U.S. Grant." Now, I put 11:50 because I had moved from the Richmond-Lynchburg road going to the northwest on the Richmond-Farmville road. The Meade and Sheridan had both been trying to find me. It took a couple of hours to find me. I wanted to leave no doubt as to what I had been doing and where I was. I said specifically where I was. I'm 4 miles west of Walker's Church. Walker's Church is 12 miles east of Appomattox Court House, which means I had 8 miles to go. And I also offered, if you note a conciliatory message, I will meet where you wish to meet. I let him determine the place. I sent Orville E. Babcock and Captain Dunn ahead of me to find a place to meet, and my escort of some 13, 14 men began pounding through that Virginia mud. And Babcock and Dunn got to Appomattox Court House. Now, at a distance, Orville Babcock, Lieutenant Colonel Babcock, resembles me somewhat, and a lot of the men in the Army of Northern Virginia thought it was me, and that maybe I was surrendering to Lee. Well, Babcock found Lee after some struggle. Remember now, the hostilities are still on. White handkerchiefs and flags are still being used, and the possibility of being killed is still very real. So Babcock and Dunn found General Lee. He was sitting under an apple tree with his legs hanging off the road, which was sunken down and worn down. No, the legend is he was asleep under an apple tree. No, he was not. General Lee was not asleep. Babcock found him, gave him my response. Lee then sent Lieutenant Colonel Marshall into Appomattox Court House, and Babcock and Dunn accompanying him, to find a suitable place for us to meet. Well, they saw McLean, former McLean, Wilmer McLean, who was one of the few people who hadn't fled the village, and asked him about a meeting place. He showed him an unfinished building that was empty, and Marshall said, "No, this won't do." And he looked at McLean's house. He said, "Let's meet there." McLean didn't want him to meet in his house, because he feared what would ultimately happen, and he didn't want us in the house. I'll explain that in a moment. McLean has the oddity of having the first Bull Run battle fought on his property and a shell exploding in his house. He moved to get away from the war, and now the war 4 years later is ending in his home. The irony of that is inexplicable. Well, they decided to meet in McLean's parlor, and Babcock went back to get General Lee, and with General Lee and Private Joshua Johns handling Traveler, Lee's horse, they went to the McLean home. Lee got there, I understand, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He is immaculate in his uniform. As I said, I understand it had never been worn. It was the only time, I understand, that he wore the rank of general. He had the wreaths. The Confederates wore their rank insignia on their collars, and Lee always wore a 3-star rank of a colonel. But this time, he had the rank of general. It's the only time I understand he ever wore that rank. On a uniform he'd never worn. His knee-high boots were polished to a gleam with spurs, bright white shirt, the cadet gray soft blue uniform. He looked magnificent. He looked like Mars, the god of war. But he was sitting in that parlor by an unlit fireplace, cold fireplace, waiting for me patiently. Nothing, I understand, was being said by the person or two in the parlor, Babcock and Charles Marshall, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall. I got to the village at about 2 o'clock or so. I saw Sheridan. I said, "Where is Lee?" And Sheridan pointed down the stage road and he said, "He's in that house right down there waiting on you." And I said, "Well, let's be about it." Rode down the stage road. At this point, I want to talk a bit about what I was wearing and why. I was wearing clothing I'd had on for several days. I haven't bathed all week. I've been on the move. We've been almost at a run, keeping up with Lee, pursuing him. I've had very little sleep. I am filthy from not having bathed. My hair is greasy and filthy. I'm coated, spattered with mud from the rains all week, and this morning, that 8-mile ride through the mud. And if you'll recall, I'd gotten up this morning with that migraine headache, and I got on Cincinnati with no spurs, no hat cords, no sword. I don't wear a sword. My usual clothing attire when I travel with the Army. I wasn't expecting to meet General Lee. When I had, on the 5th, got a note from Sheridan that said, "I wish you were with me," 3-4 days ago, I had left immediately the night of the 5th, and about 10:30 I got to Sheridan. I had left behind my van with my personal belongings. That's why I've got on the sack coat, the trousers, the same clothing I've had on for a week with no bathing. I'm filthy. And when I got the note from General Lee, there 4 miles west of Walker's Church, I had a decision to make. I could wait and send back to somebody to find my van, and I didn't know how long that would take, and get a more appropriate uniform. And who knows how long it would have been before I could have gotten the uniform back to me and bathed and put on a uniform appropriate for the occasion. I knew that there were 100,000 or more men in 2 armies, with Lee 12 to 15,000 in a vice grip in between them. Now those 2 armies are looking across at Lee's army. Lee's army of Northern Virginia is looking in both directions at those 2 armies. These are the most dedicated of Lee's soldiers. They've been with him, many of them, all during the 4 years of war. And make no mistake, there was plenty of fight left in the remnant of the Army of Northern Virginia. And I knew that even being filthy notwithstanding, I was not going to take the time to wait to get a proper uniform when there are more than 100,000 men looking at each other, and all of them on edge, all of them inured to killing by now. And all it would take would be for one man to get nervous or angry and fire a shot. One misfire, somebody drops a weapon and it goes off, and the battle, the slaughter would be on, because the Confederates were saying, come ahead, Yank, if you want some more fight, because we got plenty. I was not going to wait for a better uniform or to bathe or clean up. I went straight to Lee. So the criticism that I dressed in a muddy, sloppy uniform simply to insult Lee is bosh and nonsense. It's pure romance. I got there to stop the killing, and I got to Lee as soon as I can. Now, General Lee has been in Appomattox for at least a full day, and he's got his personal van with him, so he had access to the immaculate uniform that he put on. And he was asked about that, and he said, well, I may be General Grant's prisoner, so I must look my best. And General Porter Alexander suggested to Lee that they go for the woods and begin guerrilla fighting. And Lee said, no, that would mean that men would be without rations on their own, without officer supervision, and would result in a bloody, ongoing warfare. It must stop here and now. So he went to the McLean house. I get to the McLean house around 2 o'clock or so. I went up the steps and into the parlor to meet General Lee. He's across the room by the fireplace. He rose and we met in the center of the room. We shook hands. It was the only time that the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac were ever in the same place at the same time. That morning, when Lee had gone out under a flag of truce to send me the note that he wanted to talk of surrender, was the only time that Lee ever appeared under a flag of truce. We talked a moment, and I'm filthy. I'm 5'8", he's about 5'10" or 5'11", so he's a little taller than I am. And I did not think of it at the time, but after the surrender, I thought of the contrast we must have presented, with me muddy and indeed even slovenly looking, and General Lee immaculate with shiny boots. I was a bit awkward to have finally met General Lee again. We met briefly in the Mexican War, and I talked for a while, and after a half hour or so, General Lee said, we must be about business. And I asked him if he remembered meeting me in the Mexican War. He said, yes, he did, but he couldn't remember my face, the features, but I'd grown a beard too. I think he was just being polite. And we did indeed meet in the Mexican War one time. He was on General Scott's staff. I believe he was his chief of staff. I'd been on a scouting mission all day and came to meet General Lee dressed in dirty clothing. General Lee dressed me down for coming to General Scott without my appropriate uniform on. I'd gone straight to him from the scouting mission. So he dressed me down for being sloppily dressed, and here we were again, and I am even more sloppily dressed. But we sat down and talked about the surrender, what to do about it, and how to do about it. And General Lee said, well, put your terms on paper. And I said, all right. Now, I had thought about what to say, but primarily I remembered that President Lincoln said, let him up easy, General. And beyond that, I had no idea what I was going to write until I put pencil to paper, but I wrote this. General, in accordance with the substance of my letter to you of the 8th instant, I propose to receive the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit: rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Now, I wrote 5 sentences that came to 188 words, and that's all the conditions. Now, what I said in that, in our discussion as well, Rufus Ingalls had told me, needlessly, but told me, don't take their horses. We don't need their horses. We don't want their horses. Most of them are almost dead on their feet. And I told General Lee that the officers could keep their horses and sidearms. And he read it, and he corrected me. He said, you left out a "the." And I thought, always the general. I put a caret with the "the" in it. And he said also, well, General, our army is different from your army in that our men have to furnish their own horses or mules. And I smiled inwardly at that, because I thought, even at this late moment, you're still trying to stress there are 2 distinctly different countries and there aren't. Could you put in here, though, General Lee said, that the men can keep their mules? And I said, no, sir, I will not. He stiffened and reddened, and I thought I'd made him angry and was afraid I'd offended him. And I put my hand out and I said, no, General, I just don't want to put anything in here that does not absolutely have to be in this document. Your men can keep their animals. All they have to do is say, he's my horse or he's my mule. That will be the only proof necessary. And General Lee said, good. He smiled and said, that will be have a most happy effect on my men. And I said, well, most of them are farmers and they still got time to get in a crop. So they need their horses and mules. I let the officers keep their sidearms. Now, something that I did not say that's in the document, but is very important, that is a result of the document. By not taking the sidearms of the rebel officers, I took a great deal of criticism. You're letting a bunch of rebs loose in the countryside with their sidearms. And I always maintain that's not a concern. These men have given their word that they will no longer fight, and they are men of honor. They will obey their word. But what I really wanted was not to take their swords. An officer's sword is a symbol of authority. And I did not want any officers to have to surrender their sword to the conquering foe and add unnecessary insult to grievous injury. They'd lost the war. Let them keep their swords. Yes, I knew there'd be many a mantle and fireplace across the South with a sword proudly hanging over it. But my feeling was, and still is, let them have their pride. Don't add insult to injury. So by letting them keep their sidearms, I also let them keep their swords. No surrendering your sword to the conquering foe. Also, by not putting in that the enlisted men could keep, or cavalry, artillery could keep their horses, I didn't want to add a jot or tittle to this document, because I knew that until the last generation, this was going to be debated and argued about, and I didn't want to give a lawyer a single point of contention. I wanted, in practice, the utmost economy of language. There's not a word in this 188 words that I did not absolutely have to have. And that's why I told General Lee I wouldn't add about the enlisted men keeping animals. And I also put, if you'll note, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. In that sentence, I completely did away with any Confederate being hanged for treason or tried for any other war crimes. I did away with the hanging for treason. Now that exceeded my authority essentially, but President Lincoln welcomed it, Congress approved it, but I, at Appomattox, in that parlor, did away with any Confederate officer or soldier being hanged for treason or even tried for treason. And that's not stated in the document, but it is the result. And I wanted it in there. General Lee replied, Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, General, I have received your letter of this date containing the terms of surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia as proposed by you. As they are substantially the same as those expressed in your letter of the 8th instant, they are accepted. I will proceed to designate the proper officers to carry out the stipulations into effect. That was 57 words. I wrote 5 sentences. General Lee wrote 3 sentences. 188 words. He wrote 57 words. And that essentially ended the war. And I gave it to General Lee. He approved it. We needed an ink copy. I gave it to Theodore S. Bowers, Lieutenant Colonel Bowers, to write, and his hand was shaking so bad that he said, I can't write this. I handed it, therefore, to Lieutenant Colonel Ely Parker, my Seneca Chief Secretary on my staff, and he has a fine hand, and he wrote out the official document in ink. But when we started to write it, we had no ink. Our ink powder was gone. So General Lee had Lieutenant Colonel Marshall check his haversack, and Lieutenant Colonel Marshall, Charles Marshall, General Lee's assistant, had some powder. We mixed ink. So the surrender documents, the terms, and the acceptance are written with Confederate ink on federal paper. And I think that is a supreme irony. We had a true coming together even on the paper that the document is written on, federal paper with Confederate ink. Also, the healing began in that parlor. I let those officers keep their swords. I let the men have their animals to take home and get a crop in. I said if they'll go back home and obey the laws where they reside, there will be no disturbance by United States authority. So much was involved in that document, that 188 words, that's not specifically stated. And I would have you know that and to ponder what was put in the document. I gave General Lee a copy of the conditions. He gave me a copy of his acceptance. No, we didn't countersign. No, there's not one document. There are 2 documents, the conditions that he got, the acceptance that I got. And then he left. He went outside to, Traveler was brought around to the front to get Traveler. The only sign of emotion that I saw was he pounded his fist in his hand as he put on his gloves 3 times. That was the only visible demonstration I saw from General Lee. His face was impassive. I do not know how he felt. He heaved a sigh when he sat Traveler. And I don't know if he was relieved because the war was over or because he'd lost. I've been asked many times, was I exultant? I thought I would be. I thought I would be exultant over defeating Lee, but I was not. All I felt in the room with him that day was melancholy. My heart went out to him and the Army of Northern Virginia because they lost the war. They had fought valiantly for a cause that they fervently believed in. Although I felt it to be the worst cause for which any nation ever went to war, I still understood the pain of the defeat. And the Confederate soldier had proven himself to be a worthy foe, which is not to detract from his opponent. Indeed, it's to praise the Federal soldier because they had brought the Confederacy to defeat. And General Lee left. As he got on Traveler, I and my staff went out on the porch, and I lifted my hat and tipped my hat to General Lee. And as my staff, when I did so, they did so. And General Lee returned the salute, put his hat on, and then rode Traveler slowly back to his camp. One trumpet player, bugler somewhere, played Old Lang Syne, sad and sweet tune, as General Lee rode back to his men. Very quickly, though, guns began booming and bands playing on our side, and I sharply said, "Stop those guns and silence those bands. There'll be no celebrating the surrender of General Lee. These rebels are our countrymen again. There'll be no celebrating. Troops were ordered to stay in camp. No fraternizing, because I didn't want a fight to start between the soldiers, although many did fraternize. General Lee had, I asked him, would he use anything? He said he could use 25,000 or use rations, and I sent him 25,000. Actually, we were about out of rations because when we left Petersburg on April the 2nd, we took 7 days rations. Well, we were on our last day of rations today, the 9th, or that day on the 9th. And we were in need of food too, but there was plenty to be had for all. I've been asked who was in the room. These are the men who were in the room. Charles Marshall was in the room the entire time. General Lee was in the room the entire time. I was in the room the entire time. But other people who were in the room who came in and stayed a few minutes and left, because everybody wanted to be in the room for at least a few minutes, and they would go out and make room for someone else to come in. Lieutenant Colonel Orville Babcock, Major General Edward O.C. Ord, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, Captain Robert T. Lincoln, President Lincoln's son, Theodore S. Bowers, Lieutenant Colonel Bowers, who couldn't write the surrender terms because his hand was shaking so badly, Major General Phil Sheridan, Brigadier General John Rawlins, Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls, my quartermaster, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Badeau, Brigadier General George H. Sharp, a spy master, intelligence man, Brigadier General Michael Morgan, and Brigadier General Seth Williams. And Orville Babcock and Captain William Dunn had found Lee to tell him I was en route. And as I said, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall and Private Joshua Johns escorted General Lee to his office, to the McLean House. On April the 10th, later on, April the 9th, I think Colonel Bowers said, "Don't you think he should telegraph Washington to tell them Lee has surrendered?" Oh, yeah, I did so. I telegraphed President Lincoln that Lee had surrendered. The morning of April 10th, I rode out to see General Lee, and unexpectedly, and in fact I caught him in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves. He had not a frock coat with him handy. He put on a greatcoat, and we sat our horses for about a half an hour. I tried to prevail upon General Lee to order all Confederate forces to surrender. He declined to do that, said he didn't have the authority, and he'd have to talk to his president anyway. We found out later his president was already fleeing and was, I think, in Georgia by that time. Also, he said, "The South is a mighty big place, General Grant. I expect you may have to march over it 2 or 3 times to conquer it." And I said, "I expect so." And I saw there was no need in trying to change General Lee's mind. We put out this order too on April the 10th. All officers commanding posts, pickets, or detachments will pass General R.E. Lee through their lines north or south on presentation of this pass. General Lee will be permitted to visit Richmond at any time unless otherwise ordered by competent authority, and every facility for his doing so will be given by officers of the U.S. Army to whom this may be presented. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. So those orders were put out. Also, we began printing parole forms. And in fact, here is a parole form that you might look at. Thousands of these were printed, some 25,000, I think. And it's significant because Fitzhugh Lee of Lee's cavalry had already fled the area rather than surrender, but the word got out that you needed a parole pass because in going home, hostilities were still in force. You needed a parole pass to show that you were no longer a belligerent subject to be shot or hanged, that you had a pass, that you were properly paroled. So the 12,000, 13,000, 12 to 15,000 men in Appomattox all got these, but people like Fitzhugh's cavalry came back. Everybody within about a 25-mile radius were felt to be the immediate army. And many men, Fitzhugh Lee himself, came back and got a parole form. But the parole form was necessary for another reason. This is Special Orders number 73, Headquarters, Armies of the United States in the Field, April 10, 1865. All officers and men of the Confederate service paroled at Appomattox Court House, Virginia, who, to reach their homes, are compelled to pass through the lines of the Union armies, will be allowed to do so and to pass free on all government transports and military railroads. So this pass became very valuable for men so many miles, hundreds of miles from home, to get free transportation on military railroad or military steamboats. Not only to prove you were no longer fighting, but you got free transportation. By command of Lieutenant General Grant, E.S. Parker, Lieutenant Colonel, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. And one more order that was put out that I should like you to know was General Orders number 43. Headquarters, 24th Army Corps, Appomattox Court House, April 11, 1865. By agreement between the officers appointed by Generals Lee and Grant to carry out the stipulations of the Army of Northern Virginia, the evidence that an officer or enlisted man is a parole prisoner of war is the fact of his possessing a printed certificate certifying the fact. Dated Appomattox Court House, Virginia, April 10, 1865, and signed by his commanding officer or the staff officer of the same. All guards, patrols, officers, and soldiers of U.S. forces will respect such certificates, allowing free passage to the holders thereof, and observe in good faith the provisions of the surrender, that the holders shall remain unmolested in every respect. And on the 10th of April, I also headed back to Washington City to stop the government contracts that needed to be stopped. We were spending $4 million per day fighting this war. And being an old quartermaster, I knew the value of stopping those contracts. So that is what happened on April the 9th, how I saw it, how I perceived General Lee seeing it, orders that were given, and what really happened that day. And another thought, General Lee's sword. It said he offered it to me and I refused it. That is pure theater and pure fantasy. General Lee did not offer his sword. I did not mention it. I didn't want him to say anything about that sword. even though I included the sidearms, which would include his sword. I never brought up his sword. He never brought it up. So that's pure myth and legend, fantasy. So let that myth be put to rest. But that's what happened on Sunday, Palm Sunday, April 9th, 1865. This very day, the anniversary, April 9th. And with that, I must conclude that I have said quite enough. And I must be about my business. I hope you've enjoyed it and will see fit to join me again here in the gentleman's parlor in my home, where I will reflect about other circumstances, events, people, and places in the Civil War. I bid you a fond farewell.